Moscow, winter of 1984. The wind cuts through the streets with a coldness that seems to emanate from the regime itself. The city is a fortress of concrete and surveillance. Every corner has eyes, every shadow could carry a microphone, and every mistake, however small, costs a life. In the basement of an ordinary building on Arbat Street, a man has been hiding for 72 hours. He is an American intelligence officer, codenamed Atlas. For years, he infiltrated Soviet scientists and officials, gathering secrets that could tip the balance of the Cold War. But now, his cover has fallen. The KGB knows he exists. They don't know exactly who he is, but they know he's in Moscow. The hunt has begun, and time, like everything under the regime, is a weapon that oppresses him. The CIA's original plan was simple. Atlas was to find a Western embassy, enter as a refugee, and be extracted through diplomatic channels. But the KGB blocked all routes, set up mobile checkpoints, and intercepted communications even within taxi radios. He is trapped in the very heart of the Soviet Empire, without identity, without a passport, and without visible allies. On the other side of the world, inside an American naval base, a seemingly absurd proposal emerges to send a small group of Navy SEALs into the Soviet Union. Officially, impossible. But unofficially, anything is possible. The mission is codenamed White Dagger. SEALs aren't spies, they're soldiers. Their job is dirty, direct, and without witnesses. But now they would have to act like ghosts inside the most heavily guarded city on the planet. The difference is that, this time, the enemy isn't in a desert or a jungle. It's in every window, in every radio, in every person who looks for a second longer than they should. The man leading the operation is Lieutenant Mark Donovan, 32, a veteran of multiple infiltrations in the Middle East, experienced, disciplined, and cool-headed enough to breathe calmly under pressure. He receives a 3-page dossier. On the cover, a phrase, "If they fail, they never existed." For 3 days, Donovan and his team study Moscow as if it were a deadly labyrinth. Subway lines, transport routes, patrol intervals, blackout windows. Everything needs to be perfect because a mistake will mean not only their death, but an international crisis capable of reigniting the Cold War. Meanwhile, Atlas struggles to maintain his sanity inside the dark room where he hides. The curtains are taped shut, and the sound of the wind mingles with distant sirens. He knows that soon the footsteps will come, those of the KGB, methodical, inevitable. He sleeps for minutes, eats pieces of bread, and mentally repeats the code that connects him to the CIA. 3 words that should only be uttered if he sees the right signal. No one in Washington wants to sign the authorization. The operation, if discovered, will be interpreted as an act of war. But there's an unwritten law in the shadows of espionage. When one of their own is left behind, the agency dies a little with him. And so, under the mist of a February dawn, 3 men cross the Soviet border in an unmarked plane. None of them knows if they will return alive. None carries a flag. None can be recognized. The Moscow wind blows icy cold as they land on hostile ground. And as the ice cracks beneath their boots, a phrase echoes in Donovan's mind. 3 days to find Atlas. 1 night to bring him back. They don't know it yet, but the city is watching them. Every window, every electrical wire, every anonymous face in the crowd, all are part of the enemy. And in the heart of this city of steel and silence begins the most unlikely rescue of the Cold War. The decision to attempt the impossible came wrapped in caution. There were no public mandates, hardly any official documents signed. It was a mission that only those who accepted to disappear without glory could undertake. The White Dagger plan was drawn up in closed rooms with hand-scribbled maps and routes that only made sense when read with a cold heart. Every step had to compensate for the enemy's enormous advantage: time, territory, and surveillance equipment on every street. The first task was to create a plausible narrative for the American presence in Moscow. False documents, temporary identities, indirect entry routes to avoid official check-ins. The cargo would arrive as maintenance equipment for a supposed technical team. There would be a container with tools, boxes with spare parts, everything to justify the circulation of strange men with the air of workers. No one there could look like a soldier. They camouflaged the muscle with ordinary appearances. They made the extraordinary commonplace. The team selection followed strict criteria: absolute discretion, the ability to improvise in dense urban environments, minimal fluency in Russian, and composure under pressure. Besides Donovan, the team included a locksmith and reverse engineer, a communications operator capable of intercepting and masking signals, and a combat medic for any emergency. They trained in replicas of Soviet buildings, with narrow corridors, creaking floors, and double-glazed windows. They simulated subway chases, patrol behavior, and patrol schedules. They rehearsed speaking like civilians, acting like delivery men, and disappearing like shadows. Human and SIGINT intelligence worked as one body. CIA agents on European soil collected routes, signals, and surveillance patterns, while satellites and electronic listening devices mapped interference and listening stations. They found weaknesses: a patrol that cut corners at certain times, the resupply pattern of guard posts near certain blocks, the 15-minute window between shift changes at a checkpoint that turned a guarded street into a vacant opportunity. These small flaws were all they needed to devise a way out. The most delicate component was communicating with Atlas. He possessed codes, signals, and a psychological survival routine. The exchange would be simple in theory: a radio announcement from veterans of an old jazz station concealing a call, a loaf of bread with a mark, a passenger with a specific coat. But the KGB monitored any deviation. Therefore, they created layers of redundancy: 3 distinct signals, a contingency plan if the first failed, another if the second was compromised. Each signal was a thread in a web that could, with the slightest tremor, cut the entire knot. The infiltration was carried out on multiple fronts. 2 team members would be the visible faces, maintenance technicians who circulated with boxes and tools. Donovan and the extraction specialist would move like shadows, penetrating through secondary routes, climbing service ladders, using ducts and small forgotten access points. The communications operator maintained a small, encrypted satellite link disguised as measuring equipment. They trained in silence: short gestures, coordinated hand signals, glances that meant advance or hold on. There was calculated legal and diplomatic risk. Each hypothesis was associated with a chain reaction: mass arrests, expulsion of diplomats, retaliations at borders, even the threat of a public scandal that would ignite Western capitals. This specter forced a discipline. Nothing would be narrated afterward. Nothing would become history except the essentials. Coverage, if necessary, would be minimal and created to protect the operation, not to exalt achievements. In the days leading up to the operation, the team smuggled the material through trade routes. 2 men passed through customs with machinery parts, while a third made contact with the local CIA cell that maintained a secure safe house. This safe house was a tiny room, with dust on the window and a direct line to Donovan. The rendezvous point would be there if any signal was lost. It was there that the doctor checked the kits, that the communications specialist repeatedly tested the link, and that the forged documents were reviewed under dim light. On the night of the rescue, the city was partially blacked out by a snowstorm that both helped and hindered in equal measure. The storm put pressure on the cameras, muffled the sound of footsteps, and complicated the geometry of the movements. It was exactly the kind of curve the plan would take advantage of: reduced visibility, less traffic on the streets, and ambient noise that masked missteps. But it also brought the danger of unforeseen changes in the patrol's behavior, and the chance that Atlas's shelter might be inspected by chance. The timing of the entry was calculated using synchronized clocks. Minute 00, first operator on the street. Minute 03, the technician passing with the box. Minute 05, Donovan in the side block. Minute 09, the eyes of the city still focused on an area of lesser interest. The order was clear: fast, precise, silent, no hesitation. If contact with Atlas confirmed that he was alive and able to move, the extraction would proceed according to protocol. If resistance was encountered, there were orders to break down minimal doors and extract forcefully, minimizing damage and avoiding confrontations that would draw disproportionate attention. There was also the most disturbing plan. If the entire city closed in, if the KGB tightened the noose, the alternative was an airborne exfiltration plan, a pickup point at a small, distant airfield, with wind jazz, runway lights off, and an unregistered plane landing for a few minutes to seal the exit. It was deliberate improvisation. It was the last card of someone who accepts that, when all else fails, the audacity to forge paths where none exist remains. In the early morning hours before the final move, Donovan walked alone down an empty street, checking his watch, the pattern of the lights, and the sound of doors. He heard the distant bark of a dog, felt the cold pierce his skin, and for a moment considered all the odds that weighed against them. But the decision to proceed had already been made. The cost of inaction was greater than the risk of failure. Thus, under the cover of a city that watches every step, White Dagger's plan came together. Meticulous, brutal, cerebral. And the men positioned themselves to enter where few dared even think to tread. The infiltration would not be merely physical. It would be a test of nerves, improbabilities, and loyalty. And when they finally crossed the threshold of that door, there would be no turning back. Night fell like a thick curtain over Moscow. The snow made the noise more diffuse. Footsteps that, under other circumstances, would have been perceptible 50 meters away, were now swallowed by a white blanket that transformed every sound into a whisper. Synchronized clocks showed 0. The first operator went out into the streets dressed as a technician. The box he carried was heavy, but the weight served as an excuse for hands that needed to appear normal. Donovan and the extraction specialist moved along the side like shadows, clinging to the walls, dodging lampposts and avoiding visible cameras. Entering the building was an exercise in micro-decisions. A bell rings in the distance. 2 voices in the previous corridor make an unusual arrangement, and the operator on the ground floor simulates an adjustment to the box, as any worker would. The mechanism for opening the shelter door is subtle, made with tools that look like maintenance instruments. Donovan's breathing is measured. Each exhalation is masked by ambient noise. Inside, the corridor smells of cold tea and dust. The silence weighs heavily. The doctor stays in the rear, ready, eyes scanning the dim light. The communications operator sets up the encrypted link and monitors channels that officially shouldn't exist there. The first contact is a contained anguish. A folded note in the agreed-upon place, an old code, a discreet mark on the crack in the window. Atlas responds with the expected signal, 3 knocks on a pipe, and for a few seconds everything seems to follow the plan. Donovan engages the signal and cautiously ascends. He opens the door to the room where Atlas is hiding, and the man who was trapped in the darkness appears pale, with sunken eyes moving slowly as if he had guarded his body more than his soul. He sees Donovan. There is a rapid and almost childlike recognition, an imperceptible nod, a decoded whisper. Atlas is still breathing. The extraction begins with the calculated haste of someone short on time. Atlas changes into something acceptable to the sordid world, a loose coat, a worn-out cap, and receives strict instructions. Don't look out the windows. Maintain a natural gait. Don't use prominent phrases. Donovan assesses him in seconds. Color, allergies, tremors. The doctor performs a quick check, confirms that the man is able to walk and that he wasn't carrying anything that would compromise him. The knot is untied, but there are still traps to untangle. As the team executes the planned sortie, the first sign that something has gone wrong emerges as an infamous detail. A reflection in a window pane, a glint that shouldn't be there, and the sticky feeling that someone has been staring at them for too long. A patrol alters its pattern for reasons no one could have predicted. Perhaps the cold, perhaps a routine patrol. The alert communications operator notices a spike in activity on a local frequency. The KGB had detected anomalies nearby. Now perhaps they were searching for the source. The remaining time dwindles. Donovan decides to speed up. The prearranged detour to the service stairs is activated. The technician, acting as the delivery man, makes way with a suitable excuse and goes ahead. The passage is quick, almost choreographed. As they pass through the service corridor, a guard, overwhelmed by a shift change, unexpectedly crosses their path. Donovan pretends to find something in his pocket. Atlas holds his breath with the composure of someone who has learned not to react. The guard continues on. It's a victory by centimeters. But the city reacts with two examples of its omnipresent surveillance. First, a flashlight sweeping down a side alley quickens the clocks of the running men. Second, a coded transmission emanating from a local station changes intensity and produces coordinated noises. The KGB was beginning to piece things together. In a few minutes, the mission ceases to be merely tactical. It becomes psychology applied to escape. When they venture out onto the streets, the snow offers both an advantage and a risk. Footsteps are masked by programmed maintenance noises, but also include the fear that any distinct footprint will reveal the path. The formation breaks up. Part of the group creates a banal scene, a theatrical discussion about the contents of a box, while Donovan leads Atlas and the specialist through the least guarded alley. The communications operator, in turn, emits intentional noise to mask the group's signature and confuse potential triangulations. The ability to transform noise into cover becomes as vital as any ammunition. When they reach the first extraction point, a seemingly ordinary vehicle is waiting. An old Fiat, noisy engine, local plates. The relief is visceral and short-lived. The car is a facade. The real extraction will involve a quick transfer to a convoy prepared a few blocks away. Atlas gets in, breathes heavily, closes his eyes for a second. Donovan observes every lane, every forced smile, every glance that could be remembered by witnesses. The car drives off. The final unexpected event occurs en route. An arbitrary roadside check, perhaps triggered by an anonymous call. Perhaps by a radar that detected something irregular. A red light cuts through the darkness, and a police officer requests documents. The technician acting as the driver tries to remain calm, but the tremor in his voice almost betrays his racing heart. Donovan sets the scene. A minor mechanical glitch, a plausible excuse, a plea for an act of benevolence. The communications specialist makes a micro-shift in the frequencies to create the illusion of local interference that diverts attention. Tension builds in seconds that last for hours. The policeman, a shadow of the system, examines the forms and makes a comment about the snowstorm. The driver's restrained smile works. They get through. It's a victory that costs cold blood and ingenuity, but also a reminder that luck is an integral part of every operation under enemy eyes. When the train reaches the air pickup point, the remote airfield, the men switch vehicles to an unmarked jet, covered by tarpaulins and with the runway obscured, as foreseen in the contingency plan. The takeoff is tense. The engine roars. The runway is short. The visibility is almost zero. But the aircraft rises, and for a few long minutes, the feeling of escape mixes with the physical exhaustion that corrodes their bodies. However, the operation doesn't end upon leaving Soviet airspace. The aerial extraction requires checks, confirmation of the protected individual's identity, and destruction of any material that could link the operation to its perpetrators. Devices left behind are deactivated or destroyed, communication logs are wiped, false identities revert to mere numbers. Atlas, exhausted, lies on an improvised stretcher and stares at the lights of the plane while thinking about what was left behind. Colleagues, files, a life that no longer exists. Upon landing in friendly territory, the initial report is succinct and dry. Confirmation of life, the protected person's condition, contact with command center. There is, however, an ambiguous feeling that, for each life saved, something was consumed, perhaps trust, perhaps innocence. The rescue was an operational success, marked by tactical improvisations and the intelligence that stitched together gaps where before there was only steel and surveillance. Still, the implications quickly arise. How to explain to the world that men in uniform rescued an agent on enemy soil without initiating an open incident? How to preserve secrecy while simultaneously validating the action for the intelligence and political community? Questions that aren't resolved on the runway, but which resurface forcefully when the lights go out and the men finally unfold the silent stories they carry. When the jet's fins touched friendly ground, the collective feeling was one of restrained relief. Not the mindless joy of victory, but the cynical confirmation that the machine had worked. Atlas was taken to an isolated room, examined under cold light, and subjected to clinical interrogations that would extract in hours what years of risk had accumulated. Each fragment of information he offered was like a rare coin. If used well, it could redraw maps of influence and neutralize operations that were still breathing in the midst of the Cold War. In the corridors of power, the news arrived shrouded in silence. Few knew of the mission's existence, even fewer knew the details. That was how it should be. The operation was conceived to be a blind spot in the public tapestry, discovered only by those who needed to know. There were, however, consequences that went beyond the purely operational realm and touched upon diplomacy, ethics, and the very way nations conducted espionage. Politically, the operation was buried in a file with few stamps. Officially, there was no public acknowledgement. There was a clear risk of a scandal capable of reviving tensions that the decade had tried to dampen. Diplomats worked quietly to erase any trace that could link the protagonists to the executing country. The absence of explanations became the perfect defense. Without facts, there was no public narrative to contest. But secrecy comes at a cost. Within the relationships between agencies, a knot of distrust and power grew. The CIA gained something valuable: Atlas's life, primary data, validation of risky methods, and paid with broken promises to operatives who could not be named. The SEALs unit in turn brought back more than a man. It brought the reminder that for every successful operation, there was a trail of invisible collateral damage, burned sources, ruined double lives, plans that would never be resumed. The effects on the KGB were both humiliating and deeply symptomatic. They knew something had happened. They felt the threat of control they believed they had over that city break. Internally, investigations multiplied. Who had failed? Where was the infiltration? How had they let an agent so close to their eyes slip through? The effect was a silent purge of procedures, an intensification of controls and surveillance that would translate into years of institutional paranoia. Moscow was, for a time, even more closely watched. Every window gained more fear. Every street more eyes. In moral terms, the operation sparked debates that never made headlines. To what extent is it acceptable to violate borders to save a man whose work is, in itself, a matter of ambiguous morality? For those working in the shadows, the answer is almost tautological. The obligation to the individual and the work he protects justifies exceptional measures. For jurists and diplomats, the price is the erosion of norms that protect sovereignty and the aura of legality that nations need to coexist. The line between heroic act and political transgression has, once again, become blurred. For the SEALs involved, the legacy was intimate and contradictory. They received recognition in secrecy, medals they couldn't display. They heard thank yous in closed rooms and returned to doing the work that doesn't allow fame. Psychologically, some carried the weight of what they witnessed. Atlas's life saved at the cost of lies, manipulations, and split-second decisions. Others transformed the operation into an operational resume, urban infiltration manuals, lessons on improvisation under surveillance, strategies for masking logistical routes in densely guarded cities. These lessons, passed on in hushed tones between instructors and pupils, shaped future urban incursions and defined protocols that still influence clandestine actions today, when no one reads the open manuals. From a strategic standpoint, the extraction of Atlas yielded tangible results. Documents obtained, networks dismantled, names that led to secure arrests, and the prevention of planned hostile operations. For many within the apparatus, these results justified the cost and audacity of the method. The information, it was understood, had a geostrategic value that outweighed temporary image losses or isolated diplomatic upheavals. Culturally, however, the operation remained outside the collective imagination for decades, existing as an internal legend among operators and analysts. Only fragments would later appear, in coded memoirs, in essays by historians with access to partially opened archives, or in veiled mentions in tactical instructions. Official history preferred to silence the episode. Real history preserved it as an essential chapter on the limits and possibilities of clandestine action. Looking back, the White Dagger mission stands as a double symbol. On the one hand, proof that the combination of human ingenuity, technology, and courage can challenge seemingly invulnerable surveillance apparatuses. On the other, a reflection of the fact that modern espionage is morally ambiguous by nature. Saving a man can mean harming the international order. Preserving a life can mean maintaining a lie. And both outcomes coexist uncomfortably. What remained in the end was the certainty that certain decisions, while correct in their immediate purpose, leave lasting consequences. In the case of White Dagger, these consequences were tightened security protocols in Moscow, diplomatic relations secretly reconsidered, and a tacit manual on how to operate where no one should operate. For those involved in the profession, it is a permanent reminder. Rescuing an ally can save more than just one individual, but it shapes how the world comes to watch and be watched. And at his most personal level, Atlas carried, after the operation, an even more complex double life. Gratitude for having been saved, guilt for everything he had left behind, and the weight of knowing that his freedom was only possible because others agreed to disappear so that he could exist again. For many who participate in these stories, this is the truest legacy. Not recognition, not pride, but the silent understanding that, on certain frontiers, morality is negotiated in the dark, and that the fruits of this negotiation are only harvested by those who accept silence as payment. The operation ended before dawn. Moscow awoke just as it had fallen asleep. Cold, gray, indifferent. The same streets, the same windows, the same silence that seemed unaware, or pretended not to know, of what had happened beneath its skin. Outside the narrative, nothing changed. No newspaper published a single line. No spokesperson confirmed any rumors. But in the shadows of power, the world map shifted a few millimeters. Sometimes that's how history moves. Slowly, invisibly, through actions no one will see. The men who were there returned to anonymity. Donovan received a decoration that doesn't officially exist. Atlas was transferred to a new name, a new life, a new lie. And the city, that same city that watched over everything, never knew that on that night it lost control for a few hours. Time has erased almost all traces except for the most important one. The memory that the impossible only exists until someone crosses the line. Because in the end, the war in the shadows is not made of glory, but of silence. And sometimes, silence is the only sound of victory.